There was, as you know, a South African coordinated regional peacekeeping force in position in Congo when the fighting broke out in January. Before that, there was an East African peacekeeping force. There's a United Nations peacekeeping force still in position. This time, the US is very directly concerned. And in a way, Trump's credibility is on the line. You'll have heard that he's hoping that he will win the Nobel Peace Prize. And he is touting Congo as one of the great successes that will win him, this Nobel Peace Prize.
I was just thinking about that. You just read my mind. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Readiness Report with the Daily Maverick. I just feel as if I need to say something because, when you're on camera and people can see something and you know that they can see it, but you pretend that it's not happening. I'm sweating like a pig. I beg your pardon. I'm in a very hot Washington. I thought I'd be fit and go out for a run. I've been back for a while. I still haven't stopped sweating. But if you can just focus, because today's conversation is very, very important. And we are delighted and privileged to have, I think, one of the most prominent speakers, commentators on the Great Lakes region. She's an award-winning journalist and author, speaks truth to power. And today's episode, I think, is just so difficult, and necessary. We are speaking to Michela Wrong, one of the most incisive and courageous journalists, as I said, working in the Great Lakes region of Africa. She's the author of Do Not Disturb. And I know exactly to whom I gave my copy of Do Not Disturb. It never came back. And if you are watching and listening, I want my book back, and don't pretend to be confused. It's a blue cover with black and Do Not Disturb. It's a piercing critique, I think, of Rwanda's leadership and the assassination of a gentleman called Patrick Karegeya in exile. And South Africa needs to care about it because he was assassinated. Remember that story? It was the festive season. It was quiet in Sandton. And I think they chose that time deliberately because we were all away at a luxury hotel in Sandton. A critic of Paul Kagame, a former comrade of his, I would say, someone who played a prominent role in the liberation of Rwanda. He was exiled to South Africa and assassinated in a hotel room. But it's not just a book about him. This book really examines the uncomfortable truths behind Rwanda's global image, the conflict in the DRC, even the diplomatic tensions with South Africa and the West's complicity. Fast forward, it is 2025. The war hasn't ended. Paul Kagame denies that Rwanda is behind M23. And we know the US gets involved. The DRC asks the US for intervention in exchange for minerals. It's just going on. And there's a big ceremony between Rwanda and the DRC. They're going to sign a deal. But what is this deal? And does it go to the root cause of this conflict? That's a long introduction. Hello, Michela. Welcome to the program.
Hello, Redi. Thank you very much for having me on. As I was saying, I'm a big fan of the Maverick. I think it's one of the great stars of African journalism, and I wish you much success in the future. So for me, it's a great honor to be on your program.
Thank you so much. Okay, so let's start here. What is the root cause of the ongoing instability in the DRC, and how does Rwanda factor into this?
Well, Rwanda's involvement in the DRC really dates back 3 decades, which happens to also be the period when I started reporting on the Great Lakes. What you had in 1994, of course, was the genocide in Rwanda, in which members of the Tutsi minority were particularly targeted by the government army of the day in Rwanda and the extremist militias that were operating inside that country. And you have Paul Kagame, the current president, his rebel movement, the Rwandan Patriotic Front, seizing power, and this exodus of Rwandan Hutus, supporters of the government, some of them who had played a part in the genocide of 1994, flooding into neighboring Congo and forming these massive camps. And those camps represented a big security threat for the Rwandan government, the new government set up by Paul Kagame, for quite a few years. And then in 1996, the Paul Kagame's new army decided that they'd had enough of all these raids that were taking place across the border, these attacks by these coming from the refugee camps in eastern Congo. And they basically pulled together a Congolese rebel movement. They gave it a military backing and it broke up. It went into Eastern Congo, broke up those camps, chased down the extremists and the former army fighters amidst those forces. And then most of those refugees went back to Rwanda. But ever since then, what you've had a series of interventions by Rwanda, often with Uganda joining in which they have intervened into Congo, taking advantage of the fact that the government in Kinshasa can sort of barely police that part of the world. And also taking advantage of the fact that Congo, as everyone knows, is a country that is rich in many things. It's rich in diamonds, it's rich in gold, it's rich in coltan, which is one of the strategic minerals we need for our mobile phones. It's also rich in timber, oil, rare animals, you name it, Congo has it. And Rwanda, which is a very small country, just 14 million people, a very poor country, most of its economy is actually made up of subsistence farming, so peasant farmers, and it's overpopulated, it's massively, intensely populated, has realized the advantages of having a presence in Eastern Congo. So there's a mix of interest there. And what you've had is a series of rebel groups, which are usually dominated by members of the Tutsi minority, from which Paul Kagame comes, challenging the government. Often these rebel groups are former members of the Congolese army who were supposed to be integrated, disarmed, retrained, integrated into the Congolese army. They then say they're not getting treated properly, their interests are not being respected. And then they turn against the Congolese government. And then it turns out that, surprise, surprise, Rwanda's army is heavily backing them. And this is what's happened recently with the M23, which is not a new rebel group, but it is a rebel group that had flared up in around 2012. And then had received a lot of backing from Rwanda at the time and had seized Goma briefly, the capital of North Kivu. But basically all of Rwanda's donors, its foreign allies, said, hang on, stop interfering in Eastern Congo. And they cut off funding to Rwanda. And so the M23, strangely enough, just disappeared into the bush. Anyway, they returned 3.5 years ago. And the response of the Western community was very different this time. There were all sorts of reasons why people did not condemn this intervention in the same way as they had in 2012. What we saw in January and February was that the M23, backed up by about 6,000, 7,000 Rwandan troops, seized Goma in North Kivu, then went on to seize Bukavu, spread across, ended up controlling 2 of the key provinces of Eastern Congo, North Kivu and South Kivu, and looked like they were turning their attention to Kisangani. But at that stage, things came to a grinding halt because the US intervened and said, that's enough, guys. We need to start negotiating peace terms. We can't just let this carry on. So that's where things stand at the moment. 2 provinces in the hands of the M23. This peace deal that you mentioned was signed on June the 27th. Rwanda and Congo both signed, their foreign ministers signed. In theory, Paul Kagame, the president of Rwanda, and Felix Tshisekedi, his Congolese counterpart, will be turning up in Washington to also sign another deal at a summit. And we're also waiting to see another agreement, a business agreement, which is really going to give some substance because Trump is a deal maker. And he's
a very transactional, president.
A transactional deal, win-win, in which both Congo, the DRC, and Rwanda will benefit economically. And so will a horde of US companies who, we are told, are waiting to invest in the region if only there is a guarantee of peace.
So I'm a bit skeptical about this because, the conflict in that region has been going on for a very long time. I recall even when I started as a journalist at SABC Africa, that was the area I was covering in my 20s. 20-something years down the line, there are more and more layers of complexity. I can't even keep up. If all it took to get stability was a better focus, a better use of the resources of the region, if all it took to gain some stability there was just a, hold on, guys, let's just sit down and talk. It just sounds too good to be true that you've got US business, you've got Donald Trump, who's transactional, we know that, and that his administration can just come in and bring these arch nemesis, these people who've had a historic beef, as it were, that this is all that it will take to bring stability?
Well, I share your skepticism, and many people do. And, we can go into the reasons why skepticism may be in order in a moment. I think one of the arguments I'm hearing from people is, yes, be skeptical, but give it a chance. Because one of the things they point out is this is the only deal on the table at the moment. There have been repeated meetings, there have been repeated conferences, there's been endless sort of peace programs, negotiations, mediation, much of it taking place in Africa over the last 3.5 years when the M23 re-emerged as a problem. And this is the best promise available at the moment. So what I'm hearing from diplomats in particular and analysts is like, let's give this one a chance because there's nothing else going on. And I think, the key factor in all of this is that it's the US that is involved. And like it or lump it, we all know that when the US gets involved, it can change things. African solutions to African problems has not delivered peace in Congo. God knows people have tried. There's been a whole series of talks that were being overseen by Angola, the Rwanda process. There was a peace process going on in East Africa. There was, as you know, a South African coordinated regional peacekeeping force in position in Congo when the fighting broke out in January. Before that, there was an East African peacekeeping force. There's a United Nations peacekeeping force still in position. This time, the US is very directly concerned. And in a way, Trump's credibility is on the line. You'll have heard that he's hoping that he will win the Nobel Peace Prize. And he is touting Congo as one of the great successes that will win him, this Nobel Peace Prize.
I was just thinking about that. You just read my mind because his focus was on the Middle East, right?
Yes.
And that seems wobbly. And Netanyahu doesn't always listen to him. I know Netanyahu is in town. He's in Washington now. They sometimes have tension. And then the Iran situation didn't quite go on, turn out the way that Trump had hoped. So the irony, should his ambitions for a Nobel Prize be resting on an African problem?
And you didn't even mention Ukraine and Russia, where everything's supposed to be solved overnight. But strangely enough, it's turned out to be rather more complicated than that. But yes, Congo is one of the deals that he hopes to present as a massive success story. I mean, it was quite noticeable when he was giving his remarks in the Oval Office that he clearly had no idea what he was talking about. He barely knew where Congo was and had no grasp of the details of the conflict at all. But US involvement is going to be key to this. The reason that the US is interested is because what we know about Congo's mineral industry is it's dominated by China, and that the whole world, including the US, depends on China to provide it with the components that go into all our essential high-tech gadgets that we use. And that the US is unhappy about that dependence. So if 80% of Congo's industry is in Chinese hands at the moment, the US wants to have a bigger presence. And the Congolese are very, very happy to grant it a bigger presence if it means that they can tackle and deal with the problem of Rwanda's repeated military interventions in the east of the country.
Where does that put Africa? I mean, you mentioned the South African-led peacekeeping force. There have been regional interventions. We have entered a new era of commercial diplomacy. The US is not even hiding it. That's exactly what they say is their strategy for engaging with Africa. Entering this new phase of a corporate incentive to maintain stability, not just in the DRC, but everywhere else. I'm just thinking about this corporate incentives and where does that put the citizens? What would be the best deal? Not just a conversation between the corporates and the political class, but people, I imagine, are exhausted. There are probably generations of people who have never known stability and peace in the DRC itself, in Rwanda and the DRC in relation to each other. Your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think one of the criticisms being leveled against this deal by people who are in Congo, including, for example, Denis Mukwege, who is a Nobel Peace Prize winner He's that surgeon from Eastern Congo. He comes from Bukavu, one of the cities that is now in M23 control. And he's saying this is effectively rewarding aggression because the deal doesn't even use the phrase Rwandan troops. It doesn't explicitly refer to the fact that Rwanda invaded Congo. It uses this wonderful euphemism that Rwanda commits itself to the lifting of defensive measures. That's, the equivalent of Putin referring to the invasion of Ukraine as, a military operation or a specific, I can't remember his phrase. But, that's Rwanda's equivalent, the lifting of defensive measures, which effectively means 6,000, 7,000 troops going into Eastern Congo, taking with them drones and anti-aircraft missiles, all sorts of sophisticated new weapons that Rwanda has recently been on a massive, the last few years, it's been on a massive shopping spree around the world to get the latest in technology. And it's been using all that technology to invade Eastern Congo. And all of that's referred to as defensive measures. Yes, so one of the problems that people like Denis Mukwege are pointing out is, what about the human rights angle? We know that there was a mapping report done by the United Nations in 2010 in which they found that Rwandan-supported rebels and Rwandan troops were responsible for hundreds of thousands of deaths in Eastern Congo. And the violence has just continued since then. That 617 different atrocities were listed in that report. And Mukwege is saying, what about justice? What about reparations for the victims? What about a human rights element to this deal? So he takes he's fiercely objecting to it. And he's saying it's an opaque deal, it's not transparent, and it hasn't consulted the people most directly affected, which is the Congolese citizens who have experienced violent sexual rape, looting, forcible conscription into both sides, both the Congolese militias, but also the M23. The children have been recruited, child soldiers has always been a problem in that part of the world. They've been displaced again and again. If you read the reports, hundreds of thousands of people living in tents, all the diseases the spreading of diseases that goes with that. And all of that is supposed to be sort of neatly forgotten as we just focus on transactional peace deal premised on business interests. But again, I'm sure my diplomat friends and analyst friends will say, if it can work and if it can be peace, then those people will benefit, give peace a chance. Indeed. I think in Africa, what I've learned over the decades is that it does all boil down to politics. So when people try and do business and ignore the politics, they find themselves ending up becoming very, very interested and focused on the politics. So I think you can't divide the two. And I think the people who will try to deliver this peace are going to discover that. And one of the points that the Congolese foreign minister has been making, Therese Wagner, who was there at the signing in the Oval Office, she said the US has to remain involved in this. They have to police it. Part of the deal caters for a joint verification mechanism. And that is basically a committee, as far as I can understand it, which will involve the African Union, Qatar, which has been played a big role as mediator, and the Americans. And the idea is they're going to be overseeing the various steps that are supposed to take place and then reporting back if those steps are not undertaken. And she said,
it's important that we emphasize it because sometimes, I criticize U.S. foreign policy, and we must. Everybody must be critiqued and criticized that the U.S. is interfering. It's not. That's what the parties, the signatories to this deal are saying, that remain involved because there's no trust between them. They've had it's historic. They need somebody outside to oversee. They're inviting the U.S. as well.
Yes.
Let's just move on. Yes. Okay, please finish your point before I move on to. I just wanted then to talk about Paul Kagame himself, that he continues to spread the message that Rwanda remains vulnerable, that all those people who committed a genocide did not disappear. They are always ready and waiting to attack Rwanda. And I suppose he's enjoyed some sort of diplomatic protection because of the trauma of the genocide. And also perhaps, I don't want to use a facade, but I will say that a layer of stability in Rwanda. And so his authoritarian impulses escape scrutiny because Rwanda is at peace and because the genocide was so horrific. The world failed Rwanda at that time. So nobody has the moral authority to tell him anything. And I think it's easy for him to get away with much. Let's just talk about Paul Kagame himself. You've been very, very brave in criticizing him. He has stepped into foreign lands, as you say in your book, to assassinate his critics. There are many of his critics who have fled Rwanda and they're still watching their back, no matter the distance between them and Paul Kagame. And so a reference to Kagame's positioning post-genocide, how he has managed to get the world to put a different prism on him, and he can contest one election after another, change the constitution if he wants, neutralize opponents, and yet there's just this veneer of normalcy. What words would you use to describe Paul Kagame's leadership now?
I think it's ruthless but extremely clever. And yeah, I was fascinated because I don't know if you're aware, but for about 3 weeks recently, Paul Kagame went completely AWOL, which is very unusual. This is a president. We always see him in public. He's always opening a new school or giving a speech or glad-handing some VIP who arrives in Kigali or treading the red carpet abroad. He completely disappeared. And there were rumors circulating that he had had a seizure and he was receiving medical treatment in Germany and was in a very bad way. And these rumors were only exacerbated because his security forces then went and arrested the head of the opposition, Victoire Ingabire, who lives in Rwanda. And everyone was thinking, why are they arresting her? You know, she's already under de facto house arrest ever since she was amnestied from a previous prison sentence by the president. Why are they arresting her? It seemed to bear out the fact that something rather serious had happened. He has now reappeared. Everyone, including me, we were all sitting there waiting to see what is he going to say about the signature of this peace deal, because he hadn't commented on it in public. And it was very interesting because he had an encounter with the press which went on for several hours, in which he was fairly conciliatory. He did play, as he always does, and you're quite right there, he played the genocide guilt card, which is basically to say to people, the FDLR, this is this group of rebels who had fought alongside the Congolese army, many of whom were originally extremists who fled into Congo after taking part in the genocide. The size of that group, the FDLR, has been repeatedly exaggerated, hyped. Rwanda has presented the FDLR as an existential threat. I don't know a single analyst who shares that view. They'll sort of say that this is at one stage the estimates for the numbers of men fighting for the FDLR were between 600 and 1,500 men. And you've got one of the best armed, the most disciplined, the most effective and impressive armies in Africa, and it can't deal with that kind of force. And that force represents an existential threat. But he will always play this card. He will always play the FDLR card. So during his encounter with the press, Kagame played that card, but he was also being conciliatory towards the West and sort of saying, we hope this will work, but we don't want the Congolese to play any funny games. We can't trust them, blah, blah, blah. But later on that same day, he gave an after-dinner speech. And that was the real Kagame. And a lot of it was in Kenya, Rwanda. And often he will tell the truth when he speaks in Kenya, Rwanda, and he'll be very diplomatic when he speaks in English. And he was just sort of saying, bring it on. Don't think you can threaten us. Don't think you can halt us. We put our interests first. We are indefatigable. We are unbeatable. Our military force can beat any force on the planet. We can walk for 2,000 kilometers and we can fight at the end of that 2,000 kilometer trek. And no one can beat us. It was a very confrontational speech. And listening to that, what was really noticeable was at no stage did he ever admit, he has always in public denied, which is that Rwandan troops are inside Eastern Congo propping up the M23. So that really...
And stripping the minerals, because there's a mineral stripping effort there as well. And how does this peace deal work when he hasn't even acknowledged the most basic truths?
I was listening to it and I was thinking, these are not the words of the president who is ready to make peace. These are the words of somebody who has signed a peace deal because it's just a way of kicking the can down the road. And I would draw the attention of everyone who's watching this. There is something called a Group of Experts report on the DRC, which is a UN group. It's about to be published. It's been widely. People have been reporting on this for weeks now. And this is a fascinating read. I just finished reading it. I think it's 257 pages. And what you see in that report is it looks at what's happening in Eastern Congo. And what you see is the M23, the way it has been replacing or is setting up a parallel administration in Eastern Congo, the way it has cracked down on civil society, forcibly recruited young men, removed customary chiefs who have a lot of power in that part of Congo, the way in which it's taxing local businesses, issuing title deeds so that people who are being bussed in from Rwanda, refugees, are suddenly being given lands that used to belong to IDPs to farm. So there's a sort of ethnic reorientation going on. And then it details all the military support that the Rwandans have given the M23 over the last few months. And I challenge anyone to read that report and think, this is something that's going to go into the reverse now. And this M23, which is doing all these things and setting up these parallel administrations and basically constantly announcing that they're going to take over. It's a coup d'etat as far as they're concerned. They are challenging Felix Tshisekedi and they are willing to go as far as Kinshasa. They keep announcing that. So I just challenge anyone to read that report and think, yeah, this can all be sorted out in that peace deal that was signed on June the 27th.
Mm-hmm. I'm just thinking ahead now, what happens next? I had a very interesting theory around Kabila, Joseph Kabila. He went into self-exile, right, in South Africa, and he went back to his country via Goma, which had just been taken over by M23 at that time. I just found it interesting that he felt safer in Goma under M23, and I think Rwanda facilitated his movements and so on. What's going on there? Because there's Rwanda, there's the DRC, there's the domestic situation in Rwanda. We've spoken about it and how Paul Kagame leads his country. But Tshisekedi himself doesn't seem to be secure. And the presence of Joseph Kabila, I know there was some court action against him and so on, domestically, because I imagine you would need stability in both countries, a level of continuity in leadership for this peace deal, this commercial deal even, to take root. You wouldn't want a radical change of leadership right in the middle of a peace deal. How secure is Tshisekedi? I suppose that's where I'm going with this.
Well, yes. When this crisis blew up, at a certain point, Tshisekedi's government said that they were going to set up a government of national unity. I don't believe that's happened. And I think there have been complaints from some of the, smaller parties in Kinshasa that there's no progress on that front. Joseph Kabila is in Goma. He has denounced the peace deal we've just been discussing. He sort of dismissed it as just a business deal, a trade agreement, nothing to do with him. Many people see him and see that he has these historic links to Rwanda. He was always very close to James Kabarebe, the former head of Rwanda and Congo's armed forces, who basically was the man who placed Laurent Kabila, his father, in power in Kinshasa. And then there was a falling out between the two governments. Joseph Kabila has always been very close to Kabarebe. He's always been very close to the Rwandans. He was president for 18 years. And I think a lot of people are seeing him and his relocation to Goma and Bukavu as basically the start of an attempt to set up a protectorate of Eastern Congo, which would be independent from Kinshasa and which would have excellent relations with Rwanda, which would allow Rwanda to continue hoovering up all the minerals of Eastern Congo, and would have a very harmonious relationship with Rwanda. And I think that the suspicion with Joseph Kabila is definitely that's his role. But for that very reason, I don't think that a lot of Congolese citizens are going to be very much impressed, or I don't think that move would be, and his candidacy would be particularly popular with the ordinary Congolese outside his own circle, because they would regard this as him basically working as a sort of puppet leader with Paul Kagame as the puppet maker.
Okay, let me just tell our listeners about the books you've written. If you haven't read them already, you had better do it. I want to say quite boldly, my favorite was Do Not Disturb. I mean, these are not happy stories. I don't want people listening to us thinking we are talking stories of African adventures and so on. They are dealing with really grave matters. The one also in the Footsteps of Mr. Kurtz, I read that many years ago, reviewed it on radio, living on the brink of disaster in Mobutu's Congo. That was in 2000. Those of you who are interested in Mobutu Sese Seko's leadership and how he gutted his country, the kleptocracy, how it survived over so many decades. You want to do it, you do that one. You also want to read I Didn't Do It For You, how the world betrayed a small African country. I'm talking about a story of the history of Eritrea. Is that right, Michela?
Yeah, that's right.
And then the one that really caused waves, and I find people use this term again and again when talking about contemporary corruption. It's Our Turn to Eat, the story of a Kenyan whistleblower. And then Do Not Disturb, the story of a political murder and an African regime gone bad. What are you writing now as we say goodbye?
Before we go, I also want to mention Borderlines, which is a novel I wrote, which is set in a country very similar to Eritrea. So sometimes it gets forgotten. At the moment, I'm looking at a World War II story that took place a little bit closer to home. I'm half Italian. That's where my name comes from. And it's something that happened in World War II in Italy during the Allied occupation there. So just a slight change of scene for me. Sometimes you need to change subject, but I remain very interested in what's going on in the Great Lakes, and I'm sure I'm going to be writing about it for decades to come.
Yeah. Well, thank you so very much for joining us here on the Readiness Report. Lots to think about. Your fearless journalism. We didn't even talk about journalism, but we will do that another time. Fearless journalism, clarity, moral courage. And a lot of these stories are written at great personal cost as well. Journalists and writers like yourself often get targeted, but we are glad you are still with us to share your critique and your insights. Thank you very much for joining us, Michela Wrong. Thank you.
Thank you, Redi. It's been a huge pleasure.
Thank you, folks. That's the Readiness Report. You can catch us on the Daily Maverick, on Spotify, wherever you get your podcast from. It's a joy to be with you. Bye-bye.